At least in our current day society, one of the safer options seems to be agnosticism. Seems to be a much kind of safer option. So at first sight, it does seem to be very humble and tolerant, doesn't it? Kind of virtues hugely prized in our society, and wonderfully so. Kind of maintaining the uncertainty with regard to these matters means that we'll be a lot less dogmatic, less in danger of kind of fundamentalism, perhaps. And obviously, that can bring its dangers and damage to society as well. And even just more personally as well. We just don't like it when people are too shouty or too exclusive. I don't know, maybe that's partly just to do with being English. My wife is from Canada, and what she said about I don't know how to put it. She sometimes finds us hard to read, let's just put it that way. And you can kind of see why, because unlike our North American friends, we don't like to be too keen, do we? We hate coming across as too keen. We don't like to be too brash or exuberant about things. You might have come across that book, Watching the English, the whole importance of not being earnest rule, and wanting to keep things at arm's length. And so actually, in that kind of situation, it does seem to sit quite well, doesn't it? To maintain that we don't know, or at least we can't be sure. It does seem a lot more humble and tolerant. But it also seems to be much more based in reason as well, rather than in blind faith. Here's Bertrand Russell. He says, "We want to stand upon our own feet and look fair and square at the world. Its good facts, its bad facts, its beauties and its ugliness. See the world as it is, and be not afraid of it." And we'd want to agree, wouldn't we? We don't want to just kind of unthinkingly swallow in and take in all these kind of myths and legends passed down through the centuries, kind of twisted, distorted through the years. We want to think. We want to use our minds. We want to engage with things, grapple with things. And so again, it kind of seems to be based in reason rather than blind faith. It seems to be a safer option that way. And perhaps the most personal aspect, it does seem to keep the options open, doesn't it? We hate constricting ourselves. We hate signing ourselves up to things. Just think of whenever anyone asks you to come to a party or something, what do you say? "Ooh, that sounds great. Let me check my diary and I'll get back to you. Maybe I'll be busy." We want to keep the options open, don't we? And weigh up, maybe something else will come along. We like to keep the options open. And when it comes to matters of God, well, then all the more reason, I guess, keeping things at bay will mean less pressure to conform, less pressure to change. And I guess things will feel a lot safer when we can keep things at an arm's length like that. And when we can maintain that level of uncertainty, either that we're not sure or that we just can't be sure. And it just seems a lot safer that way. The ball's in our court. We feel a bit more in control. And so even just on a very, very brief survey, we can see that there are all sorts of reasons, all sorts of, I guess, allures as to why agnosticism would feel like a safe option, why maintaining uncertainty would be quite appealing. But it's at that point, obviously, we get brought onto the word uncertainty. This is where we'll spend the rest of our time. And here's the question. So we quite like uncertainty on various levels. But just how much do we like uncertainty? Here's Bertrand Russell again. "Certainly there are degrees of certainty, and one should be very careful to emphasize that fact, because otherwise one is landed in utter skepticism. And complete skepticism would, of course, be totally barren and completely useless." Do you see what he's saying? There is a healthy dose of skepticism. We saw that earlier. We want to use our minds. We want to assess things. There is a healthy dose of skepticism, but we don't want to take it too far. Otherwise, where would we be? Here's C.S. Lewis speaking about the same thing, but using a different image. "You cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent, because the street or the garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see." Oh, I was about to say, do you see what he's saying? But that's a bad pun there. But do you get what they're getting at, though? How much do we like uncertainty? Well, as much as we do like it, maybe at some level we don't like it as much as we often think. But then we turn that on its head, And we ask this question: how uncertain are we, in fact? How uncertain are we, in fact? And my hunch is that we're a lot more certain than we often think. You see, there is no neutral ground, is there? No air that we breathe is ever neutral, and that's kind of nothing groundbreaking to say that. But we so easily forget that, don't we, when we think of the society around us. I remember speaking to a friend about her son and his primary school. And you know, in kind of classrooms, you get kind of arts and crafts on the wall, and the kids kind of work and stuff. So across the top was this big timeline across kind of historical events. And so one end of the timeline, you'll have the pyramids and stuff like that. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have Battle of Hastings, stuff you cover in history lessons. Somewhere in the middle was something to do with the birth of Jesus. But the way it was framed, this is the way it was phrased, it was when Christians believed that Jesus was born. Imagine that. As if it wasn't a historical fact alongside all these other things, as if it was just a matter of opinion, a little story. Well, I remember my own experiences from secondary school, back in A-levels, down in London. And a good number of my teachers would be so open in their critique of the Bible, in ridiculing the Bible as something worth looking at. And I choose those examples on purpose. This is just our education system. This is just normal life. And yet it is far, far from neutral. I guess the society we live in is far less uncertain than we often might think, far less neutral. But then more personally as well, what we truly believe will work its way out into our lives. And so our lives will reflect our true beliefs, won't they? I've spoken to a number of people who would identify as agnostics, so maybe at this end of the spectrum, the TAPs, if you remember them, the temporary agnostics in practice. Uncertain, but maybe leaving the door open. Speaking to them, asking them kind of where they've got in their heads, where they've got to, where they think the probabilities lie. You ask them kind of 50-50, 60-40, and obviously the numbers are quite arbitrary, but somewhere in the middle. Well, then the next question is this: what does your life reflect? And honest answers have tended to be that actually their lives reflect that they are more certain than they often like to let on. It's not like half the time, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they act like there isn't a God, and then the rest of the days they act like there is a God. No, actually, all the way through the week, if they're honest, and wonderfully honest, they say, actually, my life reflects that I'm more certain than I often like to let on. But then we come to this end of the spectrum, your PAPs, your permanent agnostics in principle. Well, the ironic thing here, of course, is that there's a lot of certainty there, isn't there? We cannot know. No one can know. No one could ever prove or disprove whether or not God exists. It's a bold claim, isn't it? And so things get very interesting at this point. See, if you stay over at this end of the spectrum, what makes you so sure? How can you be so sure that you cannot know? What's your criteria for proving or disproving? Where's that criteria from? And if there isn't a God, or we assume that there probably isn't, how do we know that that criteria is ultimate? Reason, I guess, is often the thing that's elevated here. It's what's reasonable, but where do we get our norms for reason from? Where do they originate? What's the starting point? Because if that's arbitrary, well, then where are we left? You might even term it blind faith, to use that language. Things start to unravel a little bit. But then if you come back to this end of the spectrum, your TAPs, you ask the question, well, what would convince you? We say leave the door open to being convinced if more evidence comes up. What would convince you? And often the reply that I've heard would be kind of a sign of some sort, a miracle, maybe God appearing to us. But we've got to be very careful when it comes to that, don't we? Because we'll inevitably interpret everything we encounter by virtue of our pre-existing background beliefs. We'll see everything through that lens of our pre-existing background beliefs. And so if our starting point is that there isn't a God, or that actually our life reflects that we don't really believe there is a God, well then, along comes a claim for a miraculous healing. What's our gut reaction? No, that can't be. I'm sure there must be an explanation. Do you see what I mean? We interpret everything through our pre-existing background beliefs, and so we've got to be very careful at that point. And of course, on top of that is the fact that we are not simply rational beings. Cambridge students, Cambridge alumni, we are all self-professed nerds, aren't we? On the kind of cool spectrum. Even the coolest of Cambridge people are towards one end of the spectrum. And yet even we are far more than just rational beings, aren't we? We can't reduce any person to that. The way we make decisions, the way we take in things, we take in all sorts of factors, day-to-day, bigger decisions, things throughout history. We take in all sorts of things. And so what do we do? When things seem so unclear, what do we do? Is there a way forward? Here's what one Christian writer says with this in mind. He says, we keep looking for an airtight argument. And a lot of people will say that one day, if you can give me an airtight argument, then I'll believe. We keep looking for an airtight argument, but what if instead God sent an airtight person? What if instead of an airtight argument, God sent an airtight person? Elsewhere he goes on to describe how all of us, we're all looking for the way to live well, the truth to live by, the way we can truly flourish and kind of truly live. And so you get all sorts of kind of religious leaders, don't you, who point to the way. Live this way, follow these steps. This is the way that can truly flourish. This is the way to God. Take this truth into your heart and you will truly live. Or even secular writers, 5 steps, 10 steps to X or Y. This is the truth about reality. If you can take this truth and you align yourself to this truth, then you'll see what life is really about. Well, then comes along Jesus of Nazareth, and he says something utterly remarkable, unlike any other teacher. See, his disciples, they're asking him, show us the way to God. We don't know the way, show us the way. Jesus' response? Where every other teacher points to the way, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the way. What if God didn't send an airtight argument and instead sent an airtight person? Jesus claims to be the way. It all centers on him. And that's what we find here in John's Gospel. That little encounter, chapter 14 of this little book, eyewitness account of Jesus' life. It all revolves around him. He claims to be the way, not only to show it or to explain it, he claims to be the way. And so if you want to find out whether this is true, if you want to dig into it, get to know him. What if God sent an airtight person instead? Another Christian writer describes him as the most obviously wonderful person who ever walked the face of the earth. Get to know him. What if God sent an airtight person? What we have here isn't a little treatise on, religious doctrine or kind of a list of rules on how to live well, how to get fit, how to get stronger, whatever. This is an eyewitness account of Jesus' life, a portrait of him. It all revolves around him. What if God sent an airtight person instead? And here's the most beautiful thing, I think. See, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. A bold claim. When does he say it? He says this on the night before his death on a cross. He is the way, because his death is what's paved the way back to God for people like you and me. Even though he lived the perfect life, he died the death that we deserve so that we could live. That is who this person is. And that is where we find ultimate safety. See, this is not someone who's kind of interested in power plays. As you read through this account, you find someone who claims to have authority and power over every single thing, and yet he lays down his life for our sake. That is how much he cares. That is how much he loves us. And he proves it at the cross. Ultimate safety. What if God sent an airtight person? And so as we finish, I imagine that there'll be a whole range of thoughts in this room. And as some of us here will have arrived kind of quite skeptical about Christian things, about the existence of God, I'd encourage you to read this for yourself. Read it, get to know Jesus, see what he's like. And maybe come back next week as well. We'll be looking at the truth of the resurrection, whether it's fact or fiction. Come back, dig in, see for yourself. But then I imagine also that some of us here, if we're honest, we're kind of on the fence. Maybe we've heard quite a lot of these things before. Maybe you came along to a lot of the events last week during Unexpected. Maybe you genuinely just don't know what to do. Jesus says, trust me. He says, trust me, come and follow me. I am the way and the truth and the life. What if God sent an airtight person. The question that remains then is, how will you respond to Jesus? That is the question that remains for all of us. How will you respond to Jesus? And it's an unavoidable question. Absolutely unavoidable. Not that kind of on your way out there'll be a bouncer who'll kind of stop you before you leave until you answer that question. But here's the thing, all of us here in this room have already made a decision. Every single one of us here in this room. To put it another way, all of us right now, at this present moment, are living out a decision with regard to Jesus Christ. It is unavoidable. It's not like the arena is over there, we're kind of on the side weighing up whether or not to jump in or when to jump in. We're in the arena. We're all living out a decision. It's unavoidable. How will you respond to Jesus Christ? Let me stop there. We'll have time for questions in just a moment. As we prepare, do chat on your tables. Feel free to rip apart what I've said, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think there might be feedback cards on the tables as well. We'd love to hear your feedback. Do fill those in, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Hi guys, sorry to cut in there. Do keep texting in your questions. We've had a couple texted in, but first of all, does anyone have a question from the floor? Just stick up a hand and someone come around you. Yep, down at the front. If you just wait for the mic.
Hi, you talked about at the end about how the kind of convincing sort of argument, be the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible. But what if you're an agnostic because you're not sure whether the Bible is an eyewitness account or isn't an eyewitness account, and that's why you're agnostic?
Was that last bit, could you say?
Sorry, and that's why you're agnostic, so you don't know whether the Bible's true.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. So the question would be kind of, can we take these as reliable? And then what would then be kind of our next route if our starting point isn't that they are? I'm not very scholarly, you can probably tell from my voice and attire, but actually I dressed up for today as well. Around this time last term, there was a much more scholarly mind giving a similar talk on John's Gospel, whether it's history or a hoax. That would be something really worth checking out. Because there is a lot of actually evidence, manuscript evidence, that this is what the Gospel writers wrote down, and that they were reliable eyewitnesses. In terms of, I guess, from a more personal perspective, I guess, kind of, can we trust this kind of thing? I want to ask, well, are there kind of events in history that we just kind of take for granted, all the way through history, we just think, oh, obviously, and we don't really kind of scrutinize either. And I guess oftentimes the way we come to make our decisions, like I was saying, isn't just kind of, okay, can I prove this, can I repeat it? But the way we make daily decisions, historical decisions, is actually with all sorts of other factors, eyewitness accounts included. And so from a personal level, I'd encourage you to kind of be aware that actually the way we go about weighing up evidence is like that, and I guess applying that also to John's Gospel as well. But do check out that talk, and I think there might be a couple of books at the back as well that help deal with some of those questions.
Thank you. Let's go for one texted in. So why can't we just sit on the fence indefinitely?
Ooh, good question. I remember one supervision, one of my supervisors, he says, or Young Will was my nickname for some reason. He said, "Young Will, does your bum hurt?" And I was like, I don't know. He says, well, you've been sitting on the fence for so long. Does your bum hurt? And that's irrelevant. That's just. But sitting on the fence, it does seem like a safe option, doesn't it? And a neutral option. But I'd like to suggest that it isn't as neutral as we might think it is. One, I guess, is that actually saying that we're sitting on the fence, actually, what do our lives suggest? Perhaps that it isn't actually on the fence quite, but actually our lives maybe betray a greater certainty in the other direction than we might like to portray. But then also when it comes to Jesus, it's a yes or no kind of question. Is he who he claims to be? Is what he says about himself, about what he came to do, is that true? Either it is or it isn't. It's a historical thing rather than what we make of it. And so there isn't really a way that we can sit on the fence. All of us here currently are living out a decision. Either we say, yes, Jesus is Lord, he is God, he is my Savior, or we say, no, he's not. And those are the only two options. And so actually I suggest that we can't even sit on the fence quite kind of precisely, if that makes sense.
Would anyone like to come back on that or have another question? Just stick up a hand if so. No, great, let's another one texted in. So you say that agnosticism can be coloured by incredulity, but surely this is no different from the way a Christian's view might be coloured by their faith.
Ooh, good question. Yes, is the short answer. And I guess it's acknowledging that all of us are biased, and that basically there's no one here, and no one you'll ever meet, who is completely neutral. All of us will be coloured to an extent by our pre-existing background beliefs. And so the question really is, where do those beliefs come from? Our starting point. And I guess I'd suggest that Jesus Christ coming into the world, revealing God to us, is the best starting point you can get. I guess some people might speak of kind of circular kind of arguments to say, well, okay, if this is where we're getting our authority from, then, where does that kind of come from? Obviously, we apply that to everything. Absolutely anything that is ultimate will inevitably be circular. And so your question is, well, what makes most sense then? A narrow circle would be to say that, well, this is God's word because it says it's God's word and therefore it's authoritative. And not many people would be convinced by that. But I guess you can broaden out the circle in that it encapsulates what our experiences of human life are. It incorporates our understanding of reason, in fact, and provides a more compelling basis for having reason and understanding the world around us. So actually broaden out the circle, and you see that actually our question isn't just what is our fundamental starting point, but how do we arrive at that, what makes most sense of the world around us.
Thank you. Anyone want to come back on that or have another question? Yeah, at the back there. Sorry. I'll just wait for the mic. Sorry.
Right, so it's another question. So when it comes to a belief, and if you're sitting on the fence, do you think you can choose to believe? So is it sort of an active, all right, I'm on the fence, I gotta choose, I'll choose this, or is it something that happens without you really having control over it?
Yeah, very good question. At least from our perspective, I would say yes, it is an active thing where we see this, and Jesus has his hands outreached towards us and says, will you trust me? The question for all of us in our heart of hearts is either a yes or a no. As I was saying before, oftentimes we like to keep the ball in our court, and that's when we often feel safer. So we don't want to sign ourselves up to something, we want to restrict ourselves in the future. And so that's where that kind of question comes in. It says, actually, will you trust me as the one who's in control of the world, or would you prefer to continue with yourself at the helm? And oftentimes, I guess, the language of rejection of God seems to be a bit odd, but for all of us here, in one shape or form or another, have pushed him away. Even if not kind of an outright, we're going to write the God delusion and say, yes, this is a load of rubbish. But I guess if we're honest, in our daily lives, do we live in acknowledgement of there being a God who's created us and who's worthy of our attention even? Or do we live as if that's not true? And so I guess when faced with that choice, it is an active yes or a no.
Anyone want to come? Oh yeah, at the back again.
Just back to that.
Why can't you just be on the fence on whether there is a God or not? Why does it have to focus on a faith? Because surely with the statement you said with, do you trust me, is accounted for the majority of all other religions, with Islam, with Judaism, with all the other ones. Why does it have to be towards that one? And surely just the phrase, this is the word of God, doesn't necessarily mean it necessarily is.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So why this and not other religions? Is that kind of, if I understand correctly? Oh. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I guess the question would be then, how do we come to any conclusion about God in the first place? Which I guess for a lot of people who identify as agnostic, that is the issue. Well, how can we know for sure unless God himself steps into time and history and reveals himself? And I guess that's something that's really distinctive about the Christian faith, is that here we have God himself. He doesn't kind of stay off at a distance and say, work it out yourself, come on mate, hurry up. He says, okay, I'm going to get my hands dirty, I'm going to come into time and space and history and reveal myself to you. Compare that to any other world religion, you don't get that, do you? You get other prophets kind of pointing. And again, remember here, Jesus is the only one who says, I am the way. Everyone else points to the way. I've blazed the way. Come and follow these steps and you'll find true life. You'll find God. Jesus says, I am the way. And I guess one thing that also compels me is that he doesn't say that and then sits back and says, all right, now you do the dirty work. He says that and steps towards the cross and dies for us to open up that way. And I guess there you can see his heart behind it, that it isn't a power play, but rather he is here, he is the way. I'd love to chat more though. that probably isn't the full answer.
Brilliant. Maybe one more texted in. If God is omnipotent, he knows our idea of reasonableness, and so surely Jesus should be sent again, or we should be shown something obvious that we cannot deny.
Ooh, good question. The latter part, showing something that we cannot deny, I guess kind of goes back again to our kind of pre-existing background beliefs, that actually you have people in the gospel accounts who see Jesus face to face, and they're the ones precisely who killed him, or the ones who rejected him. Time and time again, people see him face to face. They see what he does, and he says, I don't want anything to do with that. I do not want that. You are going to die. And so actually I question whether or not we would be convinced, given that actually so many people pushed him away and had him killed in the first place. I guess in terms of our reasonableness and kind of giving us an argument, this all points to the core of the Christian faith, that it is all about relationship with the living God rather than knowledge or a set of understanding. It is all about that relationship, and that is why I reach down as a person rather than plonking down a massive textbook to kind of convince you. A person who reaches out and says, I want you, and that is at the core of the Christian faith. I feel like there's another tenet to that question, but I've forgotten it.
So why shouldn't Jesus just be sent again?
That's right. He's coming back. And in fact, later on in this little conversation, that same evening, Jesus is saying that I'm coming back. I'm going away now, but I'm coming back. I'm gone to prepare a place for you by the way of the cross, but I'm coming back. But that day when he comes back will be a fearful day. Actually, one of my best friends asked the same question. Why not him just coming now? That will convince me. Well, the reason why he's waiting is to wait for many people to come back to him. Now, when he comes back to put the world right, he will have people who have clung to him and his salvation brought about by his death on the cross. I'd love to explore that further. It'd take a bit longer to explain the ins and outs, but that is an excellent, excellent question. I'd really love to chat more.
Thanks so much, Will. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Sorry if we didn't get onto your question, but Will be around afterwards and he'd love to carry on conversations with you. There's a couple of other ways too, if you want to keep thinking about this or other topics, you can do that. First of all, on the way out, you'll see there are some books on the table, including some of these Luke's accounts of Jesus' life. These are written by Christians and are intended to help you think through today's topic and other ones, and they're free for you to take away, so do have a look on the way out. Then Will mentions the feedback forms. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And there's a box to tick that says, I'm interested. If you'd like to carry on talking more about this, leave your details and someone from the Christian Union will get in contact with you. There's also a couple of courses run by local churches on at the moment that are designed specifically for students to come along, ask their questions and investigate the basics of Christianity. So do ask a friend if they bought you, or someone around can give you the details for that. We'll be back here the same time, same place next week, looking at the evidence for the resurrection. Is there any evidence for Christianity, and does it stand up to its claims? But for now, carry on chatting around tables. There should be some snacks coming round. Thanks so much for coming.